Hi guys, welcome to my channel and I am Abidul Khan Obi. You are watching Speaking of the Best History, so let's get started.
Section 10 of The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 2, by Jefferson Davis. Part 4, Chapter 24. Retreat of the Enemy, Pursuit and Battle. Night. Further retreat of the enemy. Progress of General Jackson. The enemy at Frazier's Farm. Position of General Holmes. Advance of General Longstreet. Remarkable features of the battle. Malvern Hill. Our position. The attack. Expedition of General Stuart. Destruction of the enemy's stores. Assaults on the enemy. Retreat to Westover on the James. Siege of Richmond raised. Number of prisoners taken. Strength of our forces. Strength of our forces at Seven Pines and after. Strength of the enemy. During the night, I visited the several commands along the entrenchment on the south side of the Chickahominy. General Huger's was on the right, General McLaws in the center, and General Magruder's on the left. The night was quite dark, especially so in the woods in front of our line, and in expressing my opinion to the officers that the enemy would commence a retreat before morning, I gave special instructions as to the precautions necessary, in order certainly to hear when the movement commenced. In the confusion of such a movement, with narrow roads and heavy trains, a favorable opportunity was offered for attack. It fell out, however, that the enemy did move before morning, and that the fact of the works having been evacuated was first learned by an officer on the north side of the river, who the next morning, the 29th, about sunrise, was examining their works by the aid of a field glass. Generals Longstreet and A.P. Hill were promptly ordered to recross the Chickahominy at New Bridge, and move by the Darbytown and Long Bridge roads. General Lee, having sent his engineer, Captain Meade, to examine the condition of the abandoned works, came to the south side of the Chickahominy to unite his command and direct its movements. Magruder and Huger found the whole line of works deserted, and large quantities of military stores of every description abandoned or destroyed. They were immediately ordered in pursuit, the former by the Charles City road, so as to take the enemy's army in flank, and the latter by the Williamsburg road, to attack his rear. Jackson was directed to cross the Grapevine Bridge and move down the south side of the Chickahominy. Magruder reached the vicinity of Savage Station, where he came upon the rear guard of the retreating army. Being informed that it was advancing, he halted and sent for reinforcements. 2 brigades of Huger's division were ordered to his support, but were subsequently withdrawn, it having been ascertained that the force in Magruder's front was merely covering the retreat of the main body. Jackson's route led to the flank and rear of Savage Station, but he was delayed by the necessity of reconstructing the Grapevine Bridge. Late in the afternoon, Magruder attacked the enemy with one of his divisions and 2 regiments of another. A severe action ensued, and continued about 2 hours, when night put an end to the conflict. The troops displayed great gallantry and inflicted heavy loss, but owing to the lateness of the hour and the small force engaged, the result was not decisive, and the enemy continued to retreat under cover of night, leaving several hundred prisoners, with his dead and wounded, in our hands. Our loss was small in numbers, but great in value. Among others who could ill be spared, here fell the gallant soldier, the useful citizen, the true friend and Christian gentleman, Brigadier General Richard Griffith. He had served with distinction in foreign war, and when the South was invaded, was among the first to take up arms in defense of our rights. At Savage Station were found about 2,500 men in hospital, and a large amount of property. Stores of much value had been destroyed, including the necessary medical supplies for the sick and wounded. The night was so dark that before the battle ended it was only by challenging that on several occasions it was determined whether the troops in front were friends or foes. It was therefore deemed unadvisable to attempt immediate pursuit. Our troops slept on their arms, and in the morning it was found that the enemy had retreated during the night, and by the time thus gained, he was enabled to cross the White Oak Creek and destroy the bridge. Early on the 30th, Jackson reached Savage Station. He was directed to pursue the enemy on the road he had taken, and Magruder to follow Longstreet by the Darbytown road. As Jackson advanced, he captured so many prisoners and collected so large a number of arms that 2 regiments had to be detached for their security. His progress at White Oak Swamp was checked by the enemy, who occupied the opposite side, and obstinately resisted the rebuilding of the bridge. Longstreet and A.P. Hill, continuing their advance, on the 30th came upon the foe strongly posted near the intersection of the Long Bridge and Charles City roads, at the place known in the military reports as Frazier's Farm. Huger's route led to the right of this position, Jackson's to the rear, and the arrival of their commands was awaited to begin the attack. On the 29th, General Holmes had crossed from the south side of the James River, and on the 30th was reinforced by a detachment of General Wise's brigade. He moved down the river road, with a view to gain, near to Malvern Hill, a position which would command the supposed route of the retreating army. It is an extraordinary fact that, though the capital had been threatened by an attack from the seaboard on the right, though our army had retreated from Yorktown up to the Chickahominy, and after encamping there for a time had crossed the river and moved up to Richmond, yet when at the close of the battles around Richmond McClellan retreated and was pursued toward the James River, we had no maps of the country in which we were operating. Our generals were ignorant of the roads, and their guides knew little more than the way from their homes to Richmond. It was this fatal defect in preparation and the erroneous answers of the guides that caused General Lee first to post Holmes and Wise, when they came down the river road, at New Market, where he was told was the route that McClellan must pursue in his retreat to the James. Subsequently learning that there was another road, by the Willis Church, which would better serve the purpose of the retreating foe, Holmes's command was moved up to a position on that road where, at the foot of a hill which concealed from view the enemy's line, he remained under fire of the enemy's gunboats, the huge shrieking shells from which dispersed a portion of his cavalry and artillery, though the faithful old soldier remained with the rest of his command, waiting, according to his orders, for the enemy with his trains to pass. But taking neither of the roads pointed out to General Lee, he retreated by the shorter and better route, which led by Dr. Poindexter's house to Harrison's Landing. It has been alleged that General Holmes was tardy in getting into position, and failed to use his artillery as he had been ordered. Both statements are incorrect. He first took position when and where he was directed, and soon after he moved to the last position to which he was assigned. The dust of his advancing column caused a heavy fire from the gunboats to be opened upon him, and in men who had never before seen the huge shells then fired, they inspired a degree of terror not justified by their effectiveness. The enemy, instead of being a straggling mass moving toward the James River, as had been reported, were found halted between West's house and Malvern Hill, on ground commanding Holmes's position, with an open field between them. General Holmes ordered his chief of artillery to commence firing upon the enemy's infantry, which immediately gave way. But a heavy fire of 25 or 30 guns promptly replied to our battery, and formed with the gunboats a crossfire upon General Holmes's command. The numerical superiority of the opposing force, both in infantry and artillery, would have made it worse than useless to attempt an assault unless previously reinforced, and as no reinforcements arrived, Holmes, about an hour after nightfall, withdrew to a point somewhat in advance of the one he had held in the morning. Though the enemy continued their cannonade until after dark, and most of the troops were new levies, General Holmes reported that they behaved well under the trying circumstances to which they were exposed, except a portion of his artillery and cavalry, which gave way in disorder, probably from the effect of the 10-inch shells, which were to them a novel implement of war. for when I met them, say half a mile from the point they had left, and succeeded in stopping them, another shell fell and exploded near us in the top of a wide-spreading tree, giving a shower of metal and limbs, which soon after caused them to resume their flight in a manner that plainly showed no moral power could stop them within the range of those shells. It was after a personal and hazardous reconnaissance that General Lee assigned General Holmes to his last position, and when I remonstrated with General Lee, whom I met returning from his reconnaissance, on account of the exposure to which he had subjected himself, he said he could not get the required information otherwise, and therefore had gone himself. After the close of the Battle of Malvern Hill, General Holmes found that a deep ravine led up to the rear of the left flank of the enemy's line, and expressed his regret that it had not been known, and that he had not been ordered, when the attack was made in front, to move up that ravine and simultaneously assail in flank and reverse. It was not until after he had explained with regret the lost but unknown opportunity that he was criticized as having failed to do his whole duty in the Battle of Malvern Hill. He has passed beyond the reach of censure or of praise after serving his country on many levels wisely and well. I, who knew him from our schoolboy days, who served with him in garrison and in the field, and with pride watched him as he gallantly led a storming party up a rocky height at Monterey, and was intimately acquainted with his whole career during our sectional war, bear willing testimony to the purity, self-abnegation, generosity, fidelity, and gallantry which characterized him as a man and a soldier. General Huger reported that his progress was delayed by trees which his opponent had felled across the Williamsburg road. In the afternoon, after passing the obstructions and driving off the men who were still cutting down trees, they came upon an open field, P. Williams's, where they were assailed by a battery of rifled guns. The artillery was brought up and replied to the fire. In the meantime, a column of infantry was moved to the right, so as to turn the battery, and the combat was ended. The report of this firing was heard at Frazier's Farm, and erroneously supposed to indicate the near approach of Huger's column, and, it has been frequently stated, induced General Longstreet to open fire with some of his batteries, as notice to General Huger where our troops were, and that thus the engagement was brought on. General A. P. Hill, who was in front and had made the disposition of our troops while hopefully waiting for the arrival of Jackson and Huger, states that the fighting commenced by fire from the enemy's artillery, which swept down the road, etc. This not only concurs with my recollection of the event, but is more in keeping with the design to wait for the expected reinforcements. The detention of Huger, as above stated, and the failure of Jackson to force a passage on the White Oak Swamp, left Longstreet and Hill without the expected support to maintain the unequal conflict as best they might. The superiority in numbers and advantage of position were on the side of the enemy. The battle raged furiously until 9 p.m. By that time the enemy had been driven with great slaughter from every position but one, which he maintained until he was enabled to withdraw under cover of darkness. At the close of the struggle, nearly the entire field remained in our possession, covered with the enemy's dead and wounded. Many prisoners, including a general of division, were captured, and several batteries with some thousands of small arms were taken. After this engagement, Magruder, who had been ordered to go to the support of Holmes, was recalled to relieve the troops of Longstreet and Hill. He arrived during the night with the troops of his command much fatigued by the long, hot march. In the battle of Frazier's Farm, the troops of Longstreet and Hill, though disappointed in the expectation of support, and contending against superior numbers advantageously posted, made their attack successful by the most heroic courage and unfaltering determination. Nothing could surpass the bearing of General Hill on that occasion, and I often recur with admiration to the manner in which Longstreet, when Hill's command seemed about to be overborne, steadily led his reserve to the rescue, as he might have marched on a parade. The mutual confidence between himself and his men was manifested by the calm manner in which they went into the desperate struggle. The skill and courage which made that corps illustrious on former as well as future fields were never more needed or better exemplified than on this. The current of the battle which was then setting against us was reversed, and the results which have been stated were gained. That more important consequences would have followed had Huger and Jackson, or either of them, arrived in time to take part in the conflict, is unquestionable. and there is little hazard in saying that the army of McClellan would have been riven in twain, beaten in detail, and could never, as an organized body, have reached the James River. Our troops slept on the battlefield they had that day won, and couriers were sent in the night with instructions to hasten the march of the troops who had been expected during the day. Valor less true, or devotion to their cause less sincere than that which pervaded our army and sustained its commanders, would, in this hour of thinned ranks and physical exhaustion, have thought of the expedient of retreat. But so far as I remember, no such resort was contemplated. To bring up reinforcements and attack again was alike the expectation and the wish. During the night, humanity, the crowning grace of the knightly soldier, secured for the wounded such care as was possible, not only to those of our own army, but also to those of the enemy who had been left upon the field. The battle was in many respects one of the most remarkable of the war. Here occurred on several occasions the capture of batteries by the impetuous charge of our infantry, defying the canister and grape which plowed through their ranks, and many hand-to-hand conflicts, where bayonet wounds were freely given and received, and men fought with clubbed muskets in the life-and-death encounter. The estimated strength of the enemy was double our own, and he had the advantage of being in position. From both causes it necessarily resulted that our loss was very heavy. To the official reports and the minute accounts of others, the want of space compels me to refer the reader for a detailed statement of the deeds of those who in our day served their country so bravely and so well. During the night, those who fought us at Frazier's Farm fell back to the stronger position of Malvern Hill, and by a night march the force which had detained Jackson at White Oak Swamp effected a junction with the other portion of the enemy. Early on the 1st of July, Jackson reached the battlefield of the previous day, having forced the passage of White Oak Swamp, where he captured some artillery and a number of prisoners. He was directed to follow the route of the enemy's retreat, but soon found him in position on a high ridge in front of Malvern Hill. Here, on a line of great natural strength, he had posted his powerful artillery, supported by his large force of infantry, covered by hastily constructed entrenchments. His left rested near Crew's house, and his right near Binford's. Immediately on his front the ground was open, varying in width from a quarter to half a mile, and sloping gradually from the crest, was completely swept by the fire of his infantry and artillery. To reach this open ground, our troops had to advance through a broken and thickly wooded country, traversed nearly throughout its whole extent by a swamp, passable at only a few places, and difficult at these. The whole was within range of the batteries of the heights and the gunboats in the river, under whose incessant fire our movements had to be executed. Jackson formed his line, with Whiting's division on his left and D.H. Hill's on his right, one of Ewell's brigades occupying the interval. The rest of Ewell's and Jackson's own division were held in reserve. Magruder was directed to take position on Jackson's right, but before his arrival, two of Huger's brigades came up and were placed next to Hill. Magruder subsequently formed on the right of these brigades, which, with a third of Huger's, were placed under his command. Longstreet and A.P. Hill were held in reserve, and took no part in the engagement. Owing to ignorance of the country, the dense forests impeding necessary communications, and the extreme difficulty of the ground, the whole line was not formed until a late hour in the afternoon. The obstacles presented by the woods and the swamp made it impracticable to bring up a sufficient amount of artillery to oppose successfully the extraordinary force of that arm employed by the enemy, while the field itself afforded us few positions favorable for its use, and none for its proper concentration. General W.N. Pendleton, in whom were happily combined the highest characteristics of the soldier, the patriot, and the Christian, was in chief command of the artillery, and energetically strove to bring his long-range guns and reserve artillery into a position where they might be effectively used against the enemy, but the difficulties before mentioned were found insuperable. Orders were issued for a general advance at a given signal, but the causes referred to prevented a proper concert of action among the troops. D.H. Hill pressed forward across the open field, and engaged the enemy gallantly, breaking and driving back his first line. But a simultaneous advance of the other troops not taking place, he found himself unable to maintain the ground he had gained against the overwhelming numbers and numerous batteries opposed to him. Jackson sent to his support his own division and that part of Ewell's which was in reserve. but owing to the increasing darkness and intricacy of the forest and swamp, they did not arrive in time to render the desired assistance. Hill was therefore compelled to abandon part of the ground he had gained, after suffering severe loss and inflicting heavy damage. On the right, the attack was gallantly made by Huger's and Magruder's commands. 2 brigades of the former commenced the action. The other 2 were subsequently sent to the support of Magruder and Hill. Several determined efforts were made to storm the hill at Crew's house. The brigade advanced bravely across the open field, raked by the fire of 100 cannon and the musketry of large bodies of infantry. Some were broken and gave way. Others approached close to the guns, driving back the infantry, compelling the advanced batteries to retire to escape capture, and mingling their dead with those of the enemy. For want of cooperation by the attacking columns, their assaults were too weak to break the enemy's line, and after struggling gallantly, sustaining and inflicting great loss, they were compelled successively to retire. Night was approaching when the attack began, and it soon became difficult to distinguish friend from foe. The firing continued until after 9 p.m., but no decided result was gained. Part of our troops were withdrawn to their original positions, others remained in the open field, and some rested within 100 yards of the batteries that had been so bravely but vainly assailed. The lateness of the hour at which the attack necessarily began gave the foe the full advantage of his superior position, and augmented the natural difficulties of our own. At the cessation of firing, several fragments of different commands were lying down and holding their ground within a short distance of the enemy's line, and as soon as the fighting ceased, an informal truce was established by common consent. Numerous parties from both armies, with lanterns and litters, wandered over the field seeking for the wounded, whose groans and calls on all sides could not fail to move with pity the hearts of friend and foe. The morning dawned with heavy rain, and the enemy's position was seen to have been entirely deserted. The ground was covered with his dead and wounded, and his route exhibited evidence of a precipitate retreat. To the fatigue of hard marches and successive battles, enough to have disqualified our troops for rapid pursuit, was added the discomfort of being thoroughly wet and chilled by rain. I set out to the neighboring houses to buy, if it could be had, at any price, enough whiskey to give to each of the men a single gill, but it could not be found. The foe had silently withdrawn in the night by a route which had been unknown to us, but which was the most direct route to Harrison's Landing, and he had so many hours the start that, among the general officers who expressed to me their opinion, there was but one who thought it was possible to pursue effectively. That was General T.J. Jackson, who quietly said, "They have not all got away if we go immediately after them." During the pursuit, which has just been described, the cavalry of our army had been absent, having been detached on a service which was reported as follows. After seizing the York River Railroad on June 28th, and driving the enemy across the Chickahominy, the force under General Stuart proceeded down the railroad to ascertain if there was any movement of the enemy in that direction. He encountered but little opposition, and reached the vicinity of the White House on the 29th. On his approach, the enemy destroyed the greater part of the immense stores accumulated at that depot, and retreated toward Fortress Monroe. With one gun and some dismounted men, General Stuart drove off a gunboat which lay near the White House, and rescued a large amount of property, including more than 10,000 stand of small arms, partially burned. General Stuart describes his march down the enemy's line of communication with the York River as one in which he was but feebly resisted. He says, "We advanced until, coming in view of the White House, a former plantation residence of General George Washington, at a distance of 1/4 of a mile, a large gunboat was discovered lying in the landing. I was convinced that a few bold sharpshooters could compel the gunboat to leave. I accordingly ordered down about 75, partly of the 1st and 4th Virginia Cavalry, and partly of the Jeff Davis Legion, armed with the rifled carbines. They advanced on this monster so terrible to our fancy, and a body of sharpshooters was sent ashore from the boat to meet them. To save time, I ordered up the howitzer, a few shells from which, fired with great accuracy and bursting directly over her decks, caused an instantaneous withdrawal from the sharpshooters, and a precipitous flight under headway of steam down the river. An opportunity was here offered for observing the deceitfulness of the enemy's pretended reverence for everything associated with the name of Washington, for the dwelling house was burned to the ground, not a vestige left except what told of desolation and vandalism. 9 large barges, laden with stores, were on fire as we approached. Immense numbers of tents, wagons, and cars in long trains loaded, and 5 locomotives. A number of forges, quantities of every species of quartermaster's stores and property, making a total of many millions of dollars, all more or less destroyed. I replied to a note from the commanding general that there was no evidence of a retreat of the main body down the Williamsburg road, and I had no doubt that the enemy, since his defeat, was endeavoring to reach the James as a new base, being compelled to surrender his connection with the York. If the Federal people can be convinced that this was a part of McClellan's plan, that it was in his original design for Jackson to turn his right flank, and our generals to force him from his stronghold, they certainly never can forgive him for the millions of public treasure that his superb strategy cost. Leaving 1 squadron at the White House, he returned to guard the lower bridges of the Chickahominy. On the 30th, he was directed to recross and cooperate with Jackson. After a long march, he reached the rear of the enemy at Malvern Hill on the night of July 1st, at the close of the engagement. On the 2nd of July, the pursuit was commenced, the cavalry under General Stuart in advance. The knowledge acquired since the event renders it more than probable that, could our infantry, with a fair amount of artillery, during that day and the following night, have been in position on the ridge which overlooked the plain where the retreating army was encamped on the bank of the James River, a large part of his army must have been dispersed, and the residue would have been captured. It appears from the testimony taken before the United States Congressional Committee on the Conduct of the War that it was not until July 3rd that the heights which overlooked the encampment of the retreating army were occupied, and from the manuscript notes on the war by General J.E.B. Stuart, we learn that he easily gained and took possession of the heights, and with his light howitzer opened fire upon the enemy's camp, producing great commotion. This was described by the veteran soldier General Casey of the United States Army as thus: "The enemy had come down with some artillery upon our army massed together on the river, the heights commanding the position not being in our possession. Had the enemy come down and taken possession of those heights with a force of 20 or 30,000 men, they would, in my opinion, have taken the whole of our army, except the small portion of it that might have got off on the transports." General Lee was not a man of hesitation, and they have mistaken his character who suppose caution was his vice. He was prone to attack, and not slow to press an advantage when he gained it. Longstreet and Jackson were ordered to advance, but a violent storm which prevailed throughout the day greatly retarded their progress. The enemy, harassed and closely followed by the cavalry, succeeded in gaining Westover on the James River and the protection of his gunboats. His position was one of great natural and artificial strength, after the heights were occupied and entrenched. It was flanked on each side by a creek, and the approach in front was commanded by the heavy guns of his shipping, as well as by those mounted in his entrenchments. Under these circumstances, it was deemed inexpedient to attack him, and in view of the condition of our troops, who had been marching and fighting almost incessantly for 7 days, under the most trying circumstances, it was determined to withdraw, in order to afford them the repose of which they stood so much in need. Several days were spent in collecting arms and other property abandoned by the enemy, and in the meantime some artillery and cavalry were sent below Westover to annoy his transports. On July 8th, our army returned to the vicinity of Richmond. Under ordinary circumstances, the army of the enemy should have been destroyed. Its escape was due to the causes already stated. Prominent among these was the want of correct and timely information. This fact, together with the character of the country, enabled General McClellan skillfully to conceal his retreat, and to add much to the obstructions with which nature had beset the way of our pursuing columns. We had, however, effected our main purpose. The siege of Richmond was raised, and the object of a campaign which had been prosecuted after months of preparation, at an enormous expenditure of men and money, was completely frustrated. More than 10,000 prisoners, including officers of rank, 52 pieces of artillery, and upward of 35,000 stand of small arms were captured. The stores and supplies of every description which fell into our hands were great in amount and value, but small in comparison with those destroyed by the enemy. His losses in battle exceeded our own, as attested by the thousands of dead and wounded left on every field, while his subsequent inaction shows in what condition the survivors reached the protection of the gunboats. In the Archive Office of the War Department in Washington, there are on file some of the field and monthly returns of the strength of the Army of Northern Virginia. These are the original papers which were taken from Richmond. They furnish an accurate statement of the number of men in that army at the periods named. They were not made public at the time, as I did not think it would be judicious to inform the enemy of the numerical weakness of our forces. The following statements have been taken from those papers by Major Walter H. Taylor, of the staff of General Lee, who supervised for several years the preparation of the original returns. A statement of the strength of the troops under General Johnston shows that on May 21, 1862, he had present for duty as follows: Smith's division, consisting of the brigades of Whiting, Hood, Hampton, Hatton, and Pettigrew, 10,592. Longstreet's division, consisting of the brigades of A.P. Hill, Pickett, R.H. Anderson, Wilson, Colston, and Pryor, 13,816. Magruder's division, consisting of the brigades of McLaws, Kershaw, Griffith, Cobb, Toombs, and D.R. Jones, 15,680. D.H. Hill's division, consisting of the brigades of Early, Rhodes, Rains, Featherston, and the commands of Colonels Ward and Crump, 11,151. Cavalry Brigade, 1,289. Reserve Artillery, 1,160. Total effective men, 53,688. Statement of the strength of the army commanded by General R.E. Lee on July 20, 1862. Department of Northern Virginia and North Carolina, present for duty. Department of North Carolina, 722 officers, 11,509 enlisted men. Longstreet's division, 557 officers, 7,929 enlisted men. D.H. Hill's division, 550 officers, 8,998 enlisted men. McLaws' division, 514 officers, 7,188 enlisted men. A.P. Hill's division, 519 officers, 10,104 enlisted men. Anderson's division, 357 officers, 5,760 enlisted men. D.R. Jones's division, 213 officers, 3,500 enlisted men. Whiting's division, 252 officers, 3,600 enlisted men. Stewart's cavalry, 295 officers, 3,740 enlisted men. Pendleton's artillery, 103 officers, 1,716 enlisted men. Rhett's artillery, 78 officers, 1,355 enlisted men. Total, including Department of North Carolina, 4,160 officers, 65,399 enlisted men. Army of Northern Virginia, September 22, 1862. Present for duty. Longstreet's command, 1,410 officers, 19,001 enlisted men. Jackson's command, D.H. Hill's division, 310 officers, 4,739 enlisted men. A.P. Hill's division, 318 officers, 4,435 enlisted men. Ewell's division, 280 officers, 3,144 enlisted men. Jackson's division, 183 officers, 2,367 enlisted men. Total, 2,501 officers, 33,686 enlisted men. Army of Northern Virginia, September 30, 1862. Present for duty. Longstreet's command, 1,927 officers, 26,489 enlisted men. Jackson's command, 1,629 officers, 21,728 enlisted men. Reserve artillery, 50 officers, 716 enlisted men. Total, 3,606 officers, 48,933 enlisted men. Major Taylor, in his work, states, "In addition to the troops above enumerated as the strength of General Johnston on May 21, 1862, there were 2 brigades subject to his orders then stationed in the vicinity of Hanover Junction, one under the command of General Branch. They were subsequently incorporated into the division of General A. P. Hill, and participated in the battles around Richmond." He has no official data by which to determine their numbers, but from careful estimates and conference with General Anderson, he estimates the strength of the two at 4,000 effective. Subsequent to the date of the return of the army around Richmond, heretofore given, but previous to the Battle of Seven Pines, General Johnston was reinforced by General Huger's division of 3 brigades. The total strength of these 3 brigades, according to the reports of the operations of the Army of Northern Virginia, was 5,008 effectives. Taylor says, "If the strength of these 5 be added to the return of May 21st, we shall have 62,696 as the effective strength of the army under General Johnston on May 31, 1862. Deduct the losses sustained in the Battle of Seven Pines, as shown by the official reports of casualties, say 6,084, and we have 56,612 as the effective strength of the army when General Lee assumed command." There have been various attempts made to point out the advantage which might have been obtained if General Lee, in succeeding to the command, had renewed on the 1st of June the unfinished battle of the 31st of May, and the representation that he commenced his campaign, known as the 7 days' battles, only after he had collected a great army, instead of moving with a force not greatly superior to that which his predecessor had, has led to the full exposition of all the facts bearing upon the case. In the Southern Historical Society papers, June, 1876, is published an extract from an address of Colonel Charles Marshall, Secretary and aide-de-camp to General R. E. Lee, before the Virginia Division of the Army of Northern Virginia. In it, Colonel Marshall quotes General J. E. Johnston as saying, "General Lee did not attack the enemy until the 26th of June, because he was employed from the 1st until then in forming a great army, by bringing to that which I had commanded 15,000 men from North Carolina under Major General Holmes, 22,000 men from South Carolina and Georgia, and above 16,000 men from the Valley, in the divisions of Jackson and Ewell, etc. These numbers added together make 53,000. Colonel Marshall then proceeds from official reports to show that all these numbers were exaggerated, and that one brigade, spoken of as 7,000 strong, that of General Drayton, was not known to be in the Army of Virginia until after the 7 days, and that another brigade, of which General Johnston admitted he did not know the strength, Colonel Marshall thought it safer to refer to as the Unknown Brigade, which he suggests may have been a small command under General Evans of South Carolina, who did not join the army until after it moved from Richmond. General Holmes's report, made July 15, 1862, states that on the 29th of June he brought his command to the north side of the James River, and was joined by General Wise's brigade. With this addition, his force amounted to 6,000 infantry and 6 batteries of artillery. General Ransom's brigade had been transferred from the division of General Holmes to that of General Huger a short time before General Holmes was ordered to join General Lee. The brigade of General Branch had been detached at an earlier period. It was on duty near to Hanover Junction and under the command of General J. E. Johnston before the Battle of Seven Pines. These facts are mentioned to account for the small size of General Holmes's division, which had been reduced to 2 brigades. Ripley's brigade on the 26th of June was reported to have an aggregate force of 2,366, including pioneers and the ambulance corps. General Lawton's brigade, when moving up from Georgia to Richmond, was ordered to change direction and join General Jackson in the Valley. He subsequently came down with General Jackson and reports the force which he led into the Battle of Cold Harbor on the 27th of June, 1862, as 3,500 men. General Lee, after the Battle of Seven Pines, had sent 2 large brigades under General Whiting to cooperate with General Jackson in the Valley, and to return with him according to instructions furnished. These brigades were in the Battle of Seven Pines, and were counted in the force of the army when General Lee took command of it. Lawton's Georgia Brigade, as has been stated, was diverted from its destination for a like temporary service, and is accounted for as reinforcements brought from the South. These 3 brigades, though coming with Jackson and Ewell, were not a part of their divisions, and if their numbers are made to swell the force which Jackson brought, they should be elsewhere subtracted. General J. A. Early, in the same number of the Historical Society papers, in a letter addressed to General J. E. Johnston, February 4, 1875, makes an exhaustive examination of official reports, and applies various methods of computation to the question at issue. Among other facts, he states, Drayton's brigade did not come to Virginia until after the battles around Richmond. It was composed of the 15th South Carolina and the 50th and 51st Georgia regiments, and the 3rd South Carolina Battalion. A part, if not all of it, was engaged in the fight at Secessionville, South Carolina, on the 16th of June, 1862. Its first engagement in Virginia was on the Rappahannock, 25th of August, 1862. After Sharpsburg, it was so small that it was distributed among some other brigades in Longstreet's corps. After minute inquiry, General Early concludes that the whole command that came from the valley, including the artillery, the regiment of cavalry, and the Maryland regiment and a battery then known as the Maryland Line, could not have exceeded 8,000 men. In this, General Early does not include either Lawton's brigade or the 2 brigades of Whiting, and reaches the conclusion that the whole force received by General Lee was about 23,000, about 30,000 less than your estimate. Taking the number given by General Early as the entire reinforcement received by General Lee after the Battle of Seven Pines and before the commencement of the 7 days' battles, which those who know his extreme accuracy and minuteness of inquiry will be quite ready to do, and deducing from the 23,000 the casualties in the Battle of Seven Pines, 6,084, we have 16,916. If to this be added whatever number of absentees may have joined the army in anticipation of active operations, a number which I have no means of ascertaining, the result will be the whole increment to the army with which General Lee took the offensive against McClellan. It appears from the official returns of the Army of the Potomac that on June